All right, hopefully you had some success with putting together your FizzBuzz solution. In this section, we're going to walk through the solution and make sure it's really clear exactly how it works. Remember, the whole key to the solution is recognizing exactly how that modulo operator works. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that as we are iterating through our list of numbers, we want to print out the number or fizz or buzz or FizzBuzz. So for one particular number, we print out only one thing. We don't print out like 3 and fizz for the number 3 right here. We print out only fizz. So let's get started. Step 1 is to make sure that we can iterate from 1 to n inside of our function. So I'm going to find my FizzBuzz function down here towards the bottom, and we're going to set up a loop inside of it to iterate from 1 to n. Now I know that I said a little bit ago that whenever you're doing interview questions, you want to avoid setting up manual for loops. However, this is one of those cases where we really can't get around it. We don't have any object to iterate over. We don't have any numbers, or excuse me, any array to iterate over. All we know is that we want to iterate from 1 to n. So this would be a case where we kind of are in a situation where we really want to just set up a for loop manually. So we'll set up our for loop to iterate from 1 to less than or equal to n. And each time we're going to increment by 1. Now, one important thing to keep in mind here is, yes, we do want to start at 1. If you write a lot of for loops in your life, well, you might be used to saying start off at 0. We're not starting at 0 here. The directions specifically say that we are iterating from 1 to n. So we're going to make sure we write out our loop like so. Next, what I really recommend you do in an interview setting, just to make sure you nail this question 100%, is to write out some comments to guide you. So the first thing we want to do here is check to see if the number is a multiple of both 3 and 5. So we're going to say, is the number a multiple of 3 and 5? Because if so, we want to console log and then do nothing else in this step through the loop. And that's really important. Remember, if our number is, say, equal to 3, we only want to print out fizz, and we don't want to print out the number 3. So we need to make sure that whenever we do one of these checks, we initiate the check, we print out the statement that is required, and then we do nothing else inside of this step through the loop. So let's get started by writing out the if statement that is going to check to see if our number is a multiple of both 3 and 5. So we'll say if I modulo 3 is equal to 0. So that's going to check to see if we have a multiple of 3. And if I modulo 5 is a multiple of 0, then we want to console log out FizzBuzz, like so. So that's step 1. Now, one thing that I will mention right away is if you look at this and you are kind of got a thing for numbers, you'll very quickly realize that we only are going to meet this kind of criteria right here, having a multiple of 3 and a multiple of 5, when it is a multiple of 15. So any number that is a multiple of 3 and 5 is going to be a multiple of 15, because 3 times 5 is 15. So if you came up with a solution where you said I modulo 15 and left it just like that, that's totally fine and appropriate. This is something that sometimes people do because it is just a little bit more terse and easier to read. But honestly, you're totally fine leaving it just like so. All right, so we have successfully checked to see if we are a multiple of 3 and 5. Now, the thing to recognize next is that we don't want to set up another separate if statement. So if we met this situation right here, or this condition, this is the only code, this console log is the only log that we want to execute. So essentially what I'm saying here is we want to make sure that if we meet this case, we don't execute any other code inside the for loop. And so to make sure that's the case, rather than writing out a bunch of separate if statements, we will write out a bunch of else if statements. So we're going to see if we meet this condition. If we do, great, do the console log and go on to the next step through the loop. Otherwise, if we meet this next condition, execute the next console log, and so on. So for this next one, we'll check to see if we have a multiple of 3. And I'll add a comment here just to remind myself, is the number a multiple of 3? And if it is, we will console log out fizz. Next, we'll add in the next else if. So if we have a multiple of 5, then we'll console log out buzz. And then finally, if we have failed all three if statements inside of here. So if we are not a multiple of 15, not a multiple of 3, not a multiple of 5, finally at the very end here, we will just print out the number. And so I will console log simply I, like so. Okay, you'll notice I missed my comments on these last two cases, but I think you have a reasonable idea of what those comments would be if you want to add them in. So this right here is the classic implementation of FizzBuzz. Now, you will see sometimes other situations online or other implementations that kind of condense this code down a little bit, and they might use ternary expressions or some oddities around JavaScript to shorten it. But honestly, at the end of the day, if someone asks you this question, I really recommend you basically just do exactly this right here. There's really no need to get fancy. And honestly, if you start to get fancy with FizzBuzz, that's kind of something that interviewers lock onto. Interviewers like to see that you understand advanced syntax, and they want to see that you know how some neat helpers inside JavaScript works. But if you start putting what is otherwise very straightforward, legible code like this into some really fancy one-liner, honestly, it's kind of ironic, but their first inclination, and I've seen this happen so many times in person, their first inclination is to say something like, wow, you took some really easy code and you turned it into some fancy one-liner that's really hard to understand. And so it's like, well, you know, on some questions they want you to go above and beyond and use some fancy JavaScript, but on other ones they really want it to be just straightforward and simple. And I would definitely classify FizzBuzz as one to leave as very straightforward and simple. So I really recommend you just kind of leave it in long form like this and not try to make it fancy or condense it down to anything else. Okay. Let's make sure that our tests are passing. If we flip on over to the terminal, yep, looks like we got 3 tests passing. Awesome. So again, classic FizzBuzz, all you got to remember is how that modulo operator works. As long as you do, you're going to have an easy time with this question. So now that we've conquered FizzBuzz, it's time to move on. Let's get on our next topic in the next section.